Alrighty, so let's get started. I am going to do a little introduction and invite you all to uh, follow along, and then I'll introduce our speaker and we'll get started today. So we are excited to have you guys here with us today. And for those of you that don't know us, we are the Milwaukee County Historical Society, and we're a historical membership society in downtown Milwaukee. The mission of the MCHS is to recognize and preserve our local history. In promoting a greater appreciation of Milwaukee County's heritage, the Historical Society hopes to develop a better understanding of the issues and challenges facing Milwaukee County today. The MCHS Museum and Research Center is located on Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Drive in downtown Milwaukee. Through this series, we hope to bring the MCHS to your home by diving into a variety of topics surrounded on Milwaukee's history and culture. Today's program is Ancestry.com and the Civil War, Unpacking Civil War Era Documents for Genealogists with historian and author James Marten. This workshop will explore a number of documents that search for a Civil War era ancestor might turn up in, ranging from manuscripts, US Census returns, to soldiers' homes and pension records. With this, we will discuss the non-military information that can be gleaned from these documents, as well as some of the military terminology that appears in those documents. We'll also touch on a number of other sources, including newspapers.com, pension files from the National Archives, and Find a Grave. And my name is Olivia Hoff, MCHS Programs Manager, and I will be hosting this program. A little about Zoom before we get started, a few reminders. Please keep the microphone muted. You can mute yourself by clicking the microphone button in the bottom left of your screen. There should be a red slash to the microphone. If you have a question, please write in the chat. We will be doing a Q&A session in between each section where James will call for folks to have questions into the chat if they would like, and then I'll facilitate those questions for you. Please be sure to select everyone as a recipient when you're typing out those questions. This program is being recorded for folks who weren't able to make it to the live stream, so please be aware if you do not want your likeness to be recorded, you can turn off your camera. For best viewing, please click the view button in the upper right-hand corner of your screen and select speaker view. Lastly, if you are having tech issues, please let us know in the chat and I will help you out there. And lastly, let me introduce our speaker. James Marten is a professor emeritus of history at Marquette University and the author of editor of numerous books, including Sing Not War, The Lives of Union and Confederate Veterans of the Gilded Age of America, and his latest, The 6th Wisconsin, The Long Civil War, The Biography of a Regiment. So I'm going to pass it over to you, James.
All right, thanks, Olivia, and hi, everybody. Thanks for coming today. I'm going to share my screen. Do you see my screen? Oh, continue to share.
Yes, we see the screen.
Excellent. So this is just a scattering of some of my guys, as I call them. I've been working, or had worked on this book, which just came out in April, for about 9 years. And so you kind of get to know them as my guys. These are young and old. Some of the better pictures of the 6th Wisconsin. I'm not a genealogist, or I guess I kind of am a genealogist now. I've not done my own family. My families all came in the 1870s and 80s, and we don't really know much about them going back to Germany and Norway. And I knew most of my relatives anyway. So I've never gotten used to using ancestry for my own purposes. But in writing this book about the 6th Wisconsin, I kind of became a genealogist. Just a little bit about the 6th. I'm sure we have a wide variety of information or knowledge about the Civil War, and a pretty wide spectrum of people just getting into genealogy, or probably more experience than I have, for some of you. But I won't be going into detail about the book, obviously. That's not why we're here. The 6th Wisconsin was part of the Iron Brigade. If you know something about the Civil War, you probably have heard of the Iron Brigade. It was made up of the 2nd, 6th, and 7th Wisconsin. These are regiments Each regiment has about 1,000 men to start with. The 19th Indiana were the original parts of the brigade that these regiments formed. The 24th Michigan became part of it later on. Early on, it was called the Western Brigade or the Black Hat Brigade. You can see from this picture, these are actually guys from the 2nd Wisconsin. They have distinctive uniforms. These are the old Army uniforms. These are not what most Civil War soldiers wore. They had a simplified version with the frock coat, the upturned black hats with the bugle, and the letter of their company in the middle, and the white gaiters, which the men hated, but they wore much of the war. So it's a very distinctive group, and they were often called the Black Hats by Confederates they were fighting against. But at the Battle of South Mountain in September of 1862, they performed so well, and I won't go into all the different stories as to why they were named this. They became known as the Iron Brigade. And so the book covers them from really the beginning of the war, 1861, through, and here's where the long Civil War, the biography part of this comes in, through the early 20th century. In fact, the last known veteran of the 6th Wisconsin dies in 1939. Altogether, there are about 2,000 men who serve in the regiment. And when I was designing the book, I wanted to cover what historians have come to call the long Civil War. And that can mean a lot of different things to different historians. Sometimes it's the idea is that, well, the fighting didn't really stop. Reconstruction is part of the war. Violence against African Americans suggests that the war continues. And I don't get into that. That's not really what I'm about. I have a common sense version of the long Civil War is the war didn't end for the individuals who fought it just because the shooting has stopped. And so much of what I write about is their use of memory, how they remember the war, how they want to be remembered as veterans, how communities actually do remember them. So memory is a big part of this, but also how the long-term effects of the war on individuals, families, and communities were. And much of this comes down to health. And so I do go through pension files and things like this. So I'm going to get into this here in a minute. What makes me a genealogist, at least from the standpoint of the 6th Wisconsin, is this. We created, and by we, I mean myself and 2 main research assistants, but also several other undergraduates and a few grad students who over the course of 3 or 4 years put together this spreadsheet of the nearly 2,000 men who served in the 6th Wisconsin and 24 data points about them. And if you want to take time later on, you can look at this, but they've got name, company. There are 4 cohorts of enlistees, the original cohort, draftees, guys that came in other times of the war. Their date in, the date out. So that might include the date they were killed or were noted as killed. Whether they're married, whether if they were a casualty during the war, date of birth, date of death. You can just kind of see if wife's name, how many kids, pre and post-war occupations, where they might have moved to after the war, political jobs they might have had, if they were in the soldiers' home, when they got their pension. Lots of stuff is in them. And this is why it's important for this presentation, it all came from, and I shouldn't say all, much of it came from ancestry.com. As I said, although I was familiar with Ancestry, I was hardly an expert, hardly a habitual user of the database. But over the course of the years that we were putting this together, we found it to be an extraordinary tool for researching a Civil War regiment, just as it is for researching family members. I think most of you probably have a notion that you have a Civil War ancestor, or and we can talk about this in the questions. By the way, if you have questions, I will stop time every once in a while to ask for questions. certainly feel free to type them into the chat before I get to a stopping point. They'll be facilitate questions and answers later on. So the spreadsheet made me a genealogist and a few other young, mainly women who ended up doing this. We use several sources. I mentioned Ancestry, but newspapers.com, which I was using for other reasons. And I would imagine if you are heavy into genealogy, you'll probably try it out, newspapers.com. If not, it's magic. As someone who went to grad school in the 1980s and has spent hours and hours and hours looking at microfilm of old newspapers, newspapers.com, while it doesn't have all the newspapers, obviously, there are several dozen newspapers in Wisconsin I could access through it. It has an amazingly good search engine. And so if you have kind of hesitated using it because it's an online source, it's a great online source. You have entire pages. It's not just clippings from newspapers. I think it's really quite easy to use. Fold 3, which I'll talk a little bit more later on, is the military wing of ancestry.com. In fact, newspapers.com, ancestry.com, Fold 3 are all owned by the same company. It's been spun off from the Mormon Church, actually in Utah, who have for decades been a source of genealogical and official records of families and communities. They are no longer the people who run it. And so newspapers.com, Fold 3, and of course, as I said, Ancestry. Now, one of the things that you have probably come across, and this is actually straight out of my little essay about sources in the book, something that we have to realize about these records. These are the actual records you're seeing, of course. If you haven't been on Ancestry, you know that you're getting an actual copy, photograph of a record. It's not, again, an excerpt from a record. And these records are produced during the Civil War in crowded army camps in the middle of the night in storms. There have your German and your Irish enlistees coming and signing up and speaking in thick accents with names that the Yankees that are putting down the names can't spell. There's lots of errors in the names, which gets frustrating when you're using Ancestry, which is based on names, obviously. And these mistakes get kind of fossilized in the sources. And so one of the keys that I had to kind of hammer into myself and to researchers is to make sure you're tracking the same person. For one thing, there's lots of John Williams or Frederick Martens, and Ancestry doesn't always distinguish between them. And so some of the hints I'll give along here is if you can find the names of children, for instance, later after the war or before, names of wives, if you can really nail down a death date, especially, you'll have much better luck. And so some other sources, I'm going to mention very briefly later on, Find the Grave, which again, if you have used Ancestry, you have come across Find a Grave. It shows up in Ancestry searches, but it's not part of Ancestry. It's completely different. And it has its own problems, but we'll talk about that later on. But that often gives you dates and names of family members that you can use to compare in other sources like the census. So as we built our database, as you're working on your own version of a database for your family member, you'll put in a name, a place, hopefully some kind of birthday. That's what usually we had to start with. And you start out with, the first thing you're going to find is a roster. The basic source of information that we had was rosters published in the 1880s. Now they are available in print, they're available online, but they also pop up. The Historical Society has printed versions of, or I'm sorry, virtual electronic versions of the printed rosters, which you can see here. So it's going to have names, the town that they enlist in isn't necessarily their hometown, but it's usually pretty close. The date they enlisted, and then remarks, which can be anything from where they were killed or wounded to when they were promoted to, you see William Torrey right here from Green Bay, especially mentioned for gallantry at Anderson's Gap. So this is really the basic building block of the database. In fact, I had a student go through and just reproduce the roster in a spreadsheet, which became the mother spreadsheet for all of them. There's also, however, a really useful online version because it's searchable. It's broken down by regiment. It's in, I can't imagine if you're a genealogist, you're going to come across this. Wisconsin Genealogy Trails is the website that has all the Civil War regiments. You can kind of see that in the lower left-hand corner, how it looks, the landing page, how it looks. And you can see that each regiment has its own. There are 50 infantry regiments, I think maybe less than 10 cavalry regiments, about 10 artillery regiments from Wisconsin during the war. And you can see what it looks like when you click on one of those. So it just has, you see my arrow, just alphabetically listed, the company, the date in, if they enlisted or were drafted, date out. Again, some news about that. It's a great starting point for, even if all you have is a name, maybe a regiment, it's a pretty useful thing. Something that will often happen if you know that you have a Civil War era ancestor, you know he served it from a Wisconsin regiment. That's all you've got is a name and a regiment. If you put in the name, Wisconsin Civil War Regiment, you are more than likely going to come up with this roster. Now, I know some of you are probably working on non-Wisconsin soldiers. Most states, I think pretty all states, publish this in some form or another. And my sense is most states have it online as well. It might be different than this, but it's really a nice starting point. And the thing that you're going to get, it's one of the first things you will find, or some version of it. And again, be careful of spellings and so forth. Now, just another note, if you've done Ancestry before, you know that you put in the name and any other information that you have, and you get a bunch of suggestions of sources. They're more or less useful, the list, but they aren't necessarily complete. They don't necessarily include all the records. And again, they might have several John Smiths mixed up into the same set of records. So it's a wonderful device, but make sure that you're tracking the right person. So after the roster, the most common thing to show up, I think, in a search is the census. And probably, again, if any of you have done much genealogical searching before, you've worked with the census. They are a great and confusing source. Confusing in that it is a glimpse, a moment, a slice of life. It's whoever happens to be in the house the day the census taker shows up is who's answering the questions. Now, they will, of course, list all their children and their ages and so forth, but they might not reflect the larger group of people living there. A servant might come start working for them 3 days later. A baby might be born. And I have seen references to babies that were being pregnant, but that's not usually the case. The census taker might be more or less interested in putting down, for instance, the value of real estate. You see over here, something historians have loved is that you have the real estate and the personal estate. Real estate, of course, is land. Personal estate is really everything else, including tools. In the South, would be slaves would be included there. they didn't bother to do it, at least for these people. Not everybody has value. And here's the important thing about the censi that record property. This is self-reported. This isn't tax records that say, yeah, I have about $250 worth of personal property. So you have to just take it for granted that they're right about that. So this is 1860, which is one was very important to us. I wanted to see what my guys were doing just before they entered the Army. Here's 1870, which is more or less the same. You can see these property values are rounded up or down, whichever. Keeping house is what virtually all the women, married women at least, are listed as doing. I'd say 99.8% of married women are listed as keeping house, which is going to include taking care of the chickens, feeding the lambs during lambing season. Lots of farm work is going to be encompassed in that. But you also have ages, you have relationships, you have how long they've been married if there's a couple. You have the children's name, and later you can't. I don't think you can see it because I'm there. But if they've attended school in the last year, things like that. Here's 1880, which does not. It's the 1870s, the last one that does property amounts, but they've added other things to this. They have can or can't read or write. That one is not often filled in, so you can't really take that to the bank and rely on as being an absolute truth. But it is a useful suggestion. 1890 does not exist, and again, you probably come across this if you have a late 19th century ancestor and been frustrated by it. The only part of the census that exists for 1890 are the special schedule of Union veterans. We'll get to that in a minute. This is, as we are doing our database spreadsheet, my students were, and I did about a fourth of them, I think, of the 2,000 guys. We put together things like this in a Word document, actually. So we probably have about 2,000 pages of things like this, where you have the soldier's name, company, and a little information about him, but then links to information. This is census information, so you get a sense of how their lives changed over time. I won't read these to you; you can read them yourself. But you get movement, you get changes in career, changes in their family situation. Harrison Buchanan, who was 20 years old, drafted late in the war, never married as far as we know. He's listed as a laborer as late as 1910, out of work. He lives with his father as late as 1880. And so this was important to us. He didn't leave Wisconsin. He was a farm laborer all his life. That gives us information that was useful to us. Here's Francis Daigle or Dagley. He does move Minnesota, Des Moines, Texas, back to Des Moines. He's a farmer. He's a contractor. He's a real estate agent in Iowa. He lives a long time, as you can tell. You can also tell that in 1860, he's 13. So he's born in 1847. He enlists, you can see up on top, at the age of 17. In the second Wisconsin, ends up being transferred to the 6th. So these are really useful bits of information from the census, which again, I think if you've done ancestry research in the past, you're probably pretty familiar with the census in that sense. So I mentioned that the only census schedule, as they're called, that survived the big fire of early 20th century, I think, is when the fire took place, was the 1890 Union Veteran Schedule. It is of somewhat limited use, although it is searchable. You can find your veteran there. It's organized like the other censuses by place. a census taker, and I don't know if the regular census taker did this or not. It's clear it's the same guy doing all of them here in, this is out of New York. And his name is there. The township is Elma Township. But they have the name of the veteran. They have his rank as he left, I think is probably the case. The company, the name of the regiment or a naval vessel, date of enlistment, date of discharge, length of service, how many years they were in. And that's basically it. Although at the bottom of the page, they have a very confusing sort of, so you have August Leopold, I guess is his name, is number 1. Then down at the bottom of the page, number 1 shows where he lives. And it does have disability incurred. He's wounded in the head, which would disable me certainly, or other complaints. And not everybody has those. In fact, I'd say the majority of them only have a location. They don't really have remarks. But this census person, and they had quite a, wounded in the head, shot through right arm, wounded in left foot, wounded in right ankle. These guys had it all. There's actually, I'm just looking at this, these guys might be living in the New York soldiers' home. It's why they all show a disability of some kind. So that's the census element of this. And so I'm going to pause a minute, see if any questions have arisen during the first part of this workshop. Olivia?
Anybody want to type into the chat? Feel free. Otherwise, we can continue in about a minute. One question here. How do you locate the special census?
Mean the Union Veteran Census? Go to Ancestry and type in 1890 Veteran Schedules of US Federal Census, and you'll get this. So you can actually, this is searchable by, like the rest of Ancestry, by name, and as the more information you have, the better this is going to turn out. And so I think when you go to the landing page for ancestry.com, I think there's something called Browse or something like that. You can just search the site. It's pretty easy. This pops up pretty easily, as well other things I'm going to talk about here in the next few minutes.
All right. Any other questions for this section?
Okay. Well, another very common thing to show up, if you're lucky, especially, are records of the National Home for Disabled Volunteer Soldiers, or the Soldiers' Homes. Now, this is something like 5 to 10% of Union veterans ended up in a soldiers' home, and that included state soldiers' homes. So in Milwaukee, I think you probably know that the big Gothic-looking building overlooking the baseball stadium is one of the original national soldiers' homes. It opened in 1867. That building, part of that building, opened in 1869. It's been refurbished, as you might know, and now veterans at risk of homelessness, but who are seeking jobs and so forth, can live in apartments in that building and a few others up there. But in any event, the Soldiers' Home records have a lot of great information. Now, I've got into doing Civil War veterans, which is how I sort of first got into this long Civil War idea, by doing some articles and research at the Soldiers' Home in Milwaukee. So this is the record. You see Andrew Arneson, one of my first guys. And you get a lot of information that might not appear someplace else. Certainly the Soldiers' Home records won't appear anywhere else, but it has a lot of information. He enlisted from La Crosse. He was in Company B. He was discharged in Madison, which is where most of them were discharged, in fact, at the end of the war. So he lasted through most of the war. He wasn't wounded, but he is plagued by rheumatism and hemorrhoids. which started outside Petersburg, Virginia. I'm just reading across the top. And so none of that stuff gives you much information that helps you with the genealogy, but it certainly provides information about your ancestors' military history. He's a Norwegian immigrant going on the second line. He's 60 when he goes into the home, so he's probably about 20 when he goes into the army. He's 5'8". He's got a light complexion. He was a farmer. He's lived in San Diego sometime since the war. He's married, although chances are it doesn't say he's a widower, but he might be. His next of kin is listed there. It's his son, who lives back in Wisconsin. And so this is all a little confusing in that he's discharged in Wisconsin. He's applying to the soldiers' home, I think in Milwaukee, but he seems to be living in California. So, I mean, you get more information, but again, it might muddy the water a little bit. But what you get down here are the dates in and dates out. So he's going in 1895, July. He goes in and out of the soldiers' homes. Well, it's 3, 6, 9, 12, 18, 16 times. And so he's in for a few months at a time, maybe a couple of years. He lives until 1918, it looks like to me. So over the course of almost a quarter century, Andrew was in and out of the soldiers' home. And so that provides some texture to this guy's life as to what he's been doing. He's back and forth, and this was legal. I'm not seeing if he's moving from place to place. Quite often they would be in this Milwaukee home in the summer and in the California home in the winter, or Norfolk, Virginia, or Tennessee. There are 10 or 12 different homes ultimately over time. Down below, he seems not to have died in the home. If he had died in the home, and this is some of the interesting things, it will have the effects, how much money they had, what belongings they had when they lived in a kind of a dorm at the soldiers' homes. They didn't have like private apartments. They didn't have a lot of possessions. But if they had, they'd have a uniform for the home. They might have a watch. They might have, a book or something. They would auction it off at the home and send the remainder to a widow or to a son or whatever. It's very sobering because few of them have more than $5. Some have nothing worth auctioning off. Their clothes aren't even worth anything. And a number of them don't have any close relations. They don't have next of kin. At least one I came across up here where I'm circling, instead of a son or a wife or a daughter, it was the local GAR post, the Grand Army Republic post that he belonged to. So this can give you some information that you might not already have that might help you do searches in Ancestry as well, especially with some next of kin information and locations for where they live. But again, it's a lot of this is going to be more texture and just filling out the life story of the person you're doing research on. And again, this is also searchable. My sense of it is that I don't think it always shows up in the general search, the home information. And it might be a spelling situation. It might be just the AI that is doing the search for you might not pick up that document. The census, on the other hand, I think they pick up quite a few of them. And so if you have, a few ancestors you're doing research on, you can very easily find out if they have a record. And I think this is a pretty good, I've done this search for a different group of guys. And I was pretty happy with it, I think. I think the number of guys who showed up was pretty plausible for me. I'm going to talk about pension cards. So Civil War pensions are not online for the most part. I'll talk about one exception a little bit later on. The pension files for soldiers, just like their military records for the most part, are the full record is not online. You can get certain information. What is online is the so-called pension card. Now, these actually are like, they're like 5x7 probably. This one filled out in Washington in the Pension Bureau. That's a picture of the Pension Bureau built in the late 1880s. It is now the National Building. It's a beautiful building. It's the National Building Museum now in Washington. And everybody who got a pension or actually applied for a pension would have this card. And so what you get here is, again, a name. This is Frances Dudley, we talked about earlier. You'll get the widow's name if, in fact, she applied for a pension. You'll have, again, units. Dudley had originally enlisted in the 2nd Wisconsin, also part of the Iron Brigade. He survived and ended up in the 6th Wisconsin. The 2nd Wisconsin was disbanded late in the war. And he was also disabled enough to be put into, we find out here, which you might not learn anywhere else, the Veterans Reserve Corps, which is exactly what it sounds like, is guys that are too disabled to serve in a regular unit, but healthy enough to do guard duty or be an errand person or whatever. And so you have that unit too. It has the date that he filed for a pension. He doesn't mean he got it then. He probably got it within a year or two. You have a date of death. And in fact, this was a very useful thing. If you can't find a date of death anywhere else, you might find it in the pension card, in that a widow would apply for the pension, very soon after the pensioners, the veterans' death. So you have that there. You also might see, like, she's living in Iowa when she applies for the pension. That's not often filled in, but sometimes it is, which gives you, again, a location that might help you down the road. And you have the application number, the certificate number. Now, these certificate numbers go up to almost 1 million. So you can see he's one of the very early pensions when he gets that. His wife is later. I mean, she doesn't apply for a pension until 1928. And it's later that they started renumbering in a different way when she gets her pension. Now, I'm pointing out these numbers because if you get ambitious and decide to send for, and it's easy enough to find this information on the National Archives and Records Administration website, you'll need all this information. And so you'll need the application number and the certificate number. And if the widow also got a pension, her file is put in with the veterans file. And you'll need her numbers too. I looked at about 350 pension files, mainly in Washington. And so I was filling out a whole different thing. But I needed these numbers. And I did not know that until I got there. So I looked this up. On Ancestry, they actually tell you to go to Ancestry and look it up in the pension file database. And this is what it looks like. And so if you're Civil War veteran, lived until the 1890s, it's a very good chance you got a pension. The law is changed in 1890 so that you didn't have to be disabled. And by disabled, they mean not being able to support yourself by manual labor. You didn't have to be disabled in the line of duty by sickness or wounding. You could simply be disabled and have served at least 3 months in the Union Army, just honorably. And so most men who are given pensions after 1890 are doing it because they've gotten older. I mean, they're in their 50s. They're not very old by our standards. But it's a great way to find out if they have a pension. And again, the pension cards can give you information that you might not get otherwise. So any questions about anything so far now?
Give me a second to type in the chat. All right. No questions.
Okay,
Oh, just kidding. Sorry, Douglas. What would you expect to find if you sought the pension file?
let's put a pin in that one. I'm going to talk about pension files a little bit.
All right.
There are some online, not about soldiers, but for widows, and the same applies to them. So I'll kind of cover that in a few minutes, if that's all right.
That's perfect.
Okay. Some of them might show up. So I have a couple of occasional documents that show up if you do it. Is an application for a headstone or marker. If you've ever been to a cemetery that has lots of veterans, now you might just see them driving by the county stadium. I've lived in Milwaukee too long. American Family Field, where the veteran cemetery is. You'll see all these identical, and they're not literally identical. They went through a couple of different designs over the 170 years they've been burying people there. But every cemetery, certainly in northern states, have at least a few of these markers of Civil War veterans, and they came free. But you had to apply for them. And so this is Michael Ambrose, who was a private in Company D of the 6th Wisconsin Volunteers. The date of death is actually on here. You can see, I think it's on my screen, it's obscured, but right over here. Again, another place to find a date of death. You can find out where he's buried. If you don't already know that, he's buried at the VA facility, West Allis, Milwaukee County. So this is 1945. So this is probably a replacement stone. I don't know. I don't have his whole record here in front of me. He might have been an inmate at a resident of the Soldiers' Home. Something like 40, I think, of the Wisconsin 6 guys ended up at the Soldiers' Home in Milwaukee. And usually that means they were buried there. Just a couple were taken away and buried someplace else. You can see it's called the VA by this time. That changes in 1930. The interesting thing is that they're still getting it from Vermont. This is all Vermont stone. Most veterans' monuments and headstones are made in Vermont or New Hampshire. And Wood, Wisconsin, which doesn't really exist as a thing anymore. And so, so there's information there. Here you have just handwritten, born Ireland. So in this case, it's not a family member, and sometimes it's a family member, sometimes it's the GAR post, as in other things. This is the manager of the VA here in Milwaukee. Must be probably doing a bunch of replacements of the older headstones. And so that's, again, interesting, somewhat useful. For the 6th Wisconsin, something like a quarter of the men belong to a Grand Army of the Republic post, someplace. I think that's low. That's what we found. It's probably higher than that, but probably no more than a third. The GAR, for all practical purposes, like the American Legion for Civil War veterans. And in some states, especially Kansas, Iowa, Western states, not that much farther west than Wisconsin, there is nothing like this for the state of Wisconsin and such. There are statewide listings of GAR members. And again, if you've had good luck with your searching before this, it probably doesn't have a lot of information that you don't already have. Having said that, it has names. It has, they're kind of organized by post. This is, I think, Kansas. Again, it's blocking out. In 1890, Nebraska. Kearney Post number 5. This is Western Nebraska. Kearney Post number 5 in 1895. These are members of the 6th Wisconsin. And again, you have the date they enlisted, their occupation before the war, where they live now. This is Washington County, I think, Kansas. Ranks, company, date they joined the GAR. And you might, again, the GAR information is interesting. I think guys kind of came and went a little bit. They didn't join and stay for 40 years. Some did, but not all of them. But it adds texture to, your life of your Civil War veteran. And these vary a little bit from place to place. But GR records do show up every once in a while. Now, there are other random documents. And again, if you've been doing this for a long time, I'm sure you have come across, well, it depends on how many family members you've looked at. I came across rarely came across wills and other probate documents. But they're messy and I don't have any pictures of those. And there are a lot of forms. There are a lot of redundancy. Every time they have copies of all the newspaper, they're required to post in a newspaper that so-and-so died, they're settling his affairs. Do you have any bills you want paid? You had to print that several times. And there's lots of affidavits about identity and things like this. However, you can get a lot of juicy information about family relationships, divorces, health, for that matter, of people. My favorite, because it's so extraordinarily poignant, is a young man in the 6th Wisconsin who ended the war as a lieutenant, so he's an officer, dies within a year or two, probably a year, I think, after the war. And a fellow veteran of the 6th is his executor. He doesn't have a will, but there's a probate process. And his entire property is some Confederate money that he clearly picked up in Virginia when he was campaigning there, worth nothing. His lieutenant's epaulets, the rank insignia, a copy of a tactical training book, a few other books, things related to the war. And his friends have a little auction. They auction all his stuff. He makes mainly, $2.50, $200. I'm sorry, $2.50 or $3 on this stuff, and it goes toward burying him and putting a white picket fence around the grave. Now, I didn't always look deeply into these documents because they don't usually have information that's useful to me. This one had a fabulous story, to tell. And I also learned that, his funeral cost $17, his coffin cost $25, the cemetery plot cost $5. And clearly his friends are picking up the tab for most of that because he did not have the money to pay for that when he died. And so be patient. I guess that's the message I'm saying with this particular thing. Be patient. Take a look at it. I mean, if you're experienced at this, you'll have gotten used to getting into the rhythm of the documents. You don't have to read every word to know if this is going to lead you somewhere or be a dead end. But if you do end up with a probate file, it'll seem endless because there is so much redundancy and so much busy work and paperwork that doesn't say anything about the deceased person. But I think it's worth looking at if you've got the time. So now I do want to get to pension files. Now I said that the pensions are not online, and they aren't, but the widow's pensions are. I don't know how Fold 3 made that decision, but pension files are, to answer the earlier question, pension files are filled with official forms that a pension agent would fill out. They have doctor's certificates. They have affidavits sworn before a county clerk. All these are legal documents and all testimony taken by the applicant, by the veteran, or by his widow, or by witnesses to various things that they have to swear to, are all done, again, in front of a justice of the peace or a county clerk or a judge, someone like that. They can be anywhere from 30 to hundreds of pages, and they are a mess. which for a historian is really fun. I mean, I really enjoyed going through the original brown folders, kind of beat up. They're kind of thrown in there. My sense, generally speaking, is that they were, the most recent document was first, and the original documents were last. There would often be more than one application. If their first application failed, or if there are several changes to pension laws and they reapply because they have a different disability that they want to make a claim for, or rates change, the amount of pension you get for a certain disability might change. Some of them have notes from the clerks in that beautiful red brick pension building with abbreviations that mean nothing to me. They meant something to somebody at some time, but they are filled with narratives of soldiers and widows telling the story of their lives and getting information about when they were disabled, how they were disabled, when they were married, when their children were born. I mean, there's information that you might already have, but it is a source of that. It confirmed sources. You might not know, because there's no marriage certificate, for instance, when an ancestor married his wife. If that wife becomes a widow and applies for a pension, she has to prove she was married to that man. And if they don't have a certificate, they've got to find someone to testify, the minister, witnesses to the wedding, and that date might then show up officially in that testimony. That's just one example of what you might find. And so the pension files in general are about the health of and lives, the occupations, the difficulties they had because of their disability, the kinds of treatments they took for wounds that never quite healed, or for the dysentery or rheumatism that they had. You get hints of opiate use and abuse. You get a sense of how many people living at the margins, a lot of these guys are living in the margins. They're not, they don't end if they get a pension, it's a few dollars a month at most. You get a sense of how little actual medical attention they get over the course of their lives. They do a lot of self-medicating during that time. Anyway, you can't get the soldiers' records online, but you can get the widows. And so what I have here are kind of the process. So you go to fold 3, which if you have an ancestry.com, I think you can get that as well. Mine kind of came together. So you have to have a membership, although I think that, as always, is a free trial you can get for 7 days perhaps. And so the first thing, you come to fold 3, you follow the clicks to the US Civil War documents. Okay, I'm not going to talk you through this completely. And then you'll see at the bottom there on that first page, US Civil War widows pensions. And then you search for that and you get this next. I'm going to go through this kind of quickly because it's fairly self-explanatory. You scroll then to pensions and this by state. You might be surprised to see Alabama there, where there are Union veteran widows living in Alabama. You go to Wisconsin, you pick out. So here's one thing you do need to know. It was easier if you know the regiment they were in. And so the 6th Wisconsin is Regiment 6. See, they're in number 5 there. You choose arm of service, infantry. You choose the company and company H. Then it lists by soldier's name all of the pensions that widows received. And so you need to know, for ease of use, some information. But if you can get this far, the pension files will have the same information about the widow and this veteran as a veteran's file will have. So quite often there's information about the veterans too, because the widow will talk about her care for the veteran and her own life since the war, and what their children are doing to help support them and so forth. Now, you can search this by name from time to time, and I think it's possible to get there without doing that, without having all this information. But it's great if you do. So that's worth thinking. But a pension file is an exciting thing, but a bit of a rigmarole to get into. You can order it online. You need to have that information. And just go to the National Archives site. It's very easy to find that information. I got a few of them this way. I got PDFs via email, and they cost $85. That was about 4 or 5 years ago, so it might be more now. So that is the story about those. One more thing, and I'm sure again, if you've done any ancestry, you know about Find a Grave. It's not a ancestry site. In fact, it's a wiki type site. It's populated by individuals. So my sense is there's no editors for this. And so you take what you get. This is Edward Bragg, who was one of the colonels of the 6th Wisconsin, and his site is pretty good. You have a picture of him. I think this information is pretty reliable based on other information. But you can see that it has his date of birth and death, where he was born, where he died, where he's buried. So again, this is really about finding graves. If they have it, they'll have the plot number and so forth. I used to find his grave actually in Fond du Lac. You can see the family members down here with links to their graves. So you can really, again, in some ways, sometimes I use this as the basis for information. More often it was used to confirm information that we were a little fuzzy on. If you hit the gold mine, you will actually have an obituary show up with a citation of the newspaper it was from. And so that's actually a great part of this as well. And finally, and this is, I think, it's a moving part of this. People leave messages on Find a Grave. And so I don't know if this was Bragg's or not, but this was 6th cousin, 3 times removed. Thanks for your service type of things, American flags. Some of them might have something to do with the family, might not. They might have information. Hero at the railroad cut. That's one of the battles at Gettysburg, parts of Gettysburg that the 6th fought in. So it's kind of fun to see these. They don't help you much with your obituary, with your genealogy, but they are, again, provide some texture to our understanding of really how people think about Civil War veterans. So that's what I have for the workshop. Do we have questions?
I'll give everybody a second to type into the chat if you have questions. James has provided his email, so I'll send that in the follow-up to this program if you do come across some questions when you start digging into things.
I think the PowerPoint's too big to send. Otherwise, I'd let you do that too. But I think it's too big.
Douglas says, thank you. I look forward to reading your book.
Excellent. Thank you.
Any other questions? All right. I don't think there are any other questions.
Okay.
So we can go ahead and wrap. And thank you guys very much for attending this program today. And thank you, James, so much for a fascinating conversation and workshop about genealogy and really how to make use of those materials in the context of Civil War veterans. So really
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. And everybody, please stay tuned for our upcoming programs. We have a couple coming up next month. Our next virtual program is about the history of the Menominee River Valley, and that'll be with Corey Zetz, who is the executive director of the Menominee Valley Partners. And we also have our trivia nights every month, so check out our social medias to see where we're headed next and the dates. So thanks for following along, and if you'd like to see more programs like this one, please consider supporting the Milwaukee County Historical Society. We recognize that Milwaukee history spans across diverse communities, ethnicities, and cultures. So we hope that we continue to bring everybody together through our programs. And with that, thank you again to James for his wonderful presentation, and we hope to see you all in the upcoming virtual and in-person programs. I do have a little survey link in the chat I just sent through, so if you could give your feedback, we really appreciate it. It helps make our programs better and consistent with what you all are interested in. So really appreciate it, everybody, and we'll see you in the next one.
Thanks.
Thank you.